BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Corrie Corfield. Good evening. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has outlined her country's pathway out of lockdown, saying shops, bars, gyms and hairdressers should start opening in the last week of April. There would be a gradual easing of restrictions before then, but she said the plans were deliberately cautious. One of the government's scientific advisers has warned of what he calls vaccine deprivation, with poorer areas more prone to a new wave of infections because of lower take-up of jabs. The broadcaster and environmentalist Sir David Attenborough has said that climate change could destroy entire cities and cause civilization to break down if carbon emissions are not curbed. The US Senate has begun investigations into the storming of the Capitol building last month by supporters of Donald Trump. One of the men accused of killing the investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta more than 3 years ago has admitted her murder. Nicola Sturgeon has set out a provisional timetable for loosening the coronavirus lockdown in Scotland, with a phased but significant reopening of the economy due to begin in the last week of April. Speaking in the Holyrood Parliament, Ms Sturgeon said until then there would be a progressive easing at 3-week intervals if infection rates continued to fall. A return to school and outdoor socialising are among the priorities, as in England. But unlike the Westminster Government's plan, there are no dates beyond the end of April for a further lifting of restrictions. Opposition parties said people waiting to hear whether they could hug their loved ones would be left disappointed. But Nicola Sturgeon said she did not want to give arbitrary milestones that could change. Our Scotland correspondent James Shaw was listening.
Sure and steady is the way Nicola Sturgeon has described her approach to ending the lockdown in Scotland. Changes will happen at 3 weekly intervals up to the end of April. On the 15th of March, all primary schools will return. 3 weeks later, all secondaries will be back. 4 weeks after all schools are scheduled to return in England. Also on the 5th of April, the stay-at-home order will be lifted and 6 people from 2 households will be able to meet outside. That change will come into effect in England a week earlier. In Scotland, click and collect will start up again and some shops will be able to reopen. It might be possible for churches to open in time for Easter. Then at the end of April, most or all of Scotland could move from level 4 to level 3 restrictions. That should mean that all non-essential shops will reopen, along with pubs and restaurants, although possibly not serving alcohol. But controls could vary in different parts of the country. Ms Sturgeon said all this depended on continued suppression of the virus.
This is the moment where we have to be optimistic and positive, but also patient and sensible as well. The last thing I want to be doing at any point, the last thing any of us want to be doing at any point this year is going backwards. This must be a firm and sustainable route out of lockdown, and that is what I believe that we are putting in place.
Ruth Davidson for the Conservatives described it as a holding plan, not a route back to normality.
Everyone understands that we might not be able to give people absolute certainty, but they were expecting the First Minister to give them some kind of hope. Many will have tuned in today precisely because they were expecting to receive that. They didn't tune in today expecting to be told to tune in again in 3 weeks' time, and they have a right to be disappointed.
The First Minister insisted that getting cases to the lowest possible level was essential, and then by the summer there could be much greater freedoms. In contrast, Boris Johnson has said he's optimistic that all restrictions will be lifted by the end of June. As before in the pandemic, Scotland and England are taking different approaches. One of them may prove more effective at defeating coronavirus and achieving a return to normality.
Boris Johnson has said a government review will consider deep and complex ethical issues about whether people should have to prove they've been vaccinated against coronavirus if they want to go to the pub or the theatre. Speaking during a visit to a school in London, the Prime Minister acknowledged that fervent libertarians would object to what are being called COVID status certificates. The review will be led by the Cabinet Office Minister Michael Gove. Our political correspondent Jessica Parker reports.
Ministers had insisted that there were no plans for domestic vaccine passports, even though it was recognised a system might evolve internationally as countries looked to open up their borders. But the roadmap out of lockdown for England, published yesterday, does talk about COVID status certification, which could involve using testing or vaccination data to show people have a lower risk of passing on the virus. A review will now look at whether such a system could help reopen society. Boris Johnson this morning described the idea as a novelty.
We haven't had stuff like this before. We've never thought in terms of having something that you have to show to go to a pub or a theatre. And so there are deep and complex issues that we need to explore.
The Prime Minister said that the review would take in scientific and ethical points of view, adding he recognised that fervent libertarians might object. Labour described a review as sensible, while Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said that the idea needed to be carefully thought through. While health is a devolved matter, it's understood the UK government will seek a four nations approach. Ministers have entered this debate as it was, to some extent, happening anyway, with businesses and organisations considering how best to operate safely as restrictions are eased. But Greg Collier from the campaign group Liberty described the proposal as dangerous.
Imagine a situation where there are the immunes and the not immunes, where people are able to access normal life, public services, transport, work, perhaps even housing, based on a status which they may not be able to prove. They may not have been able to have a vaccine.
While all adults are being strongly encouraged to get a vaccine, within government it is acknowledged that not everyone will be able or willing to do so. It isn't mandatory. So it's understood testing could also be looked at as a way of allowing people to access an event or service, with the NHS app possibly used to show someone's status. But insiders insist the review has no fixed outcome in mind.
A scientific advisor to the government has warned that failure to vaccinate deprived communities as lockdown rules are eased could lead to a new wave of infections. Dr Mike Tilsley said he and other experts were concerned that people who'd not been immunised, particularly in inner cities, presented an increased risk. Our science correspondent Palak Ghosh reports.
Dr Tilsley is not alone among the government's scientific experts in fearing a national vaccine divide between rich and poor. A BBC analysis has found significant variation in uptake across the UK, with many of the more deprived London boroughs being among the lowest. The concern is that even though overall infection levels will fall, there'll be pockets of disease across the country that will hit the poorest the hardest. These pockets have not been fully accounted for in computer projections and could pose a threat to the wider population, according to Dr Tilsley.
This is a real concern, actually, for me. And I know a number of other scientists have raised this, that we may end up in this situation where we have sort of the vaccine rich, as it were, who are able to access the vaccine, who have taken up the vaccine and are at much lower risk. And there may be people in society who have not taken up the vaccine, and potentially these individuals could be clustered in particular parts of the country, and there is increased risk there.
Dr Tilsley has said that there needs to be a more active approach in identifying areas of lower uptake and delivering targeted local public health messages. One view is that poorer communities respond less well to mass national campaigns, leaving them more vulnerable to disinformation about vaccine safety.
The number of people dying with coronavirus is falling sharply in England and Wales. The Office for National Statistics says in the second week of February, the number of times COVID-19 was mentioned on a death certificate was down 20% on the previous week. Among people in care homes, deaths fell by a third. The latest daily figures show a further 548 deaths within 28 days of a positive test, taking the total to 121,305. The number of new cases was 8,489. 17.9 million people have received at least one dose of vaccine. Unemployment in the UK has reached a 5-year high, hitting 5.1% in the 3 months to December. Younger workers have borne the brunt of the job losses during the COVID crisis, as our economics correspondent Andy Verity explains.
These new figures show that as of the end of last year, there were 726,000 fewer people employed than at the start of the pandemic. Of these, 425,000 were under 25, 3/5 of the total. Among those young people, it's the least well-educated who've been hardest hit. In Blackpool, where attractions near the famous Pleasure Beach would now normally be reopening for the spring, Oliver, who has ADHD and a form of autism, is among many young people stuck without work in a town with a youth unemployment rate of 17%, twice the national average.
Sort of quite stressful, to be honest, because I'm looking for jobs. I try to apply for jobs and I don't get anything other than a email saying that you've been unsuccessful. I keep on looking and there's nothing there. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you keep on trying, I'm sure there's something you can come.
Today's figures also show that on average, pay rose by almost 5% over the year, not because everyone got a pay rise that size, but because there were fewer low-paid workers counting towards that average. The official estimate is that 3 weeks ago, as many as 6.4 million people were on furlough, with the young overrepresented. There are now growing calls for the government to extend the furlough scheme into the summer to give hard-hit sectors such as Blackpool's tourism industry enough time to get back on their feet and prevent a sharp spike upwards in unemployment.
Alex Salmond's lawyer has suggested there is a material risk the former First Minister of Scotland could be placed in legal jeopardy if he appears before an inquiry tomorrow which is looking into the Scottish Government's handling of harassment claims made against him in 2018. Earlier, the Scottish Parliament amended and republished evidence from Mr Salmond, a decision his legal team believes could compromise his oral evidence. The documents are the latest development in a furious row between Mr Salmond and the Scottish Government after he was cleared of sexual assault. Mr Salmond has claimed there was a plot to remove him from public life. Here's our political correspondent Nick Ardley.
Last night, after a long legal battle, explosive claims by Alex Salmond were published by the Scottish Parliament. In them, Mr Salmond says his former protégé, Nicola Sturgeon, misled the Parliament about when she became aware of sexual harassment allegations against him and that she broke the ministerial code on a number of occasions in doing so. Mr Salmond also alleges there was a malicious and concerted campaign against him by senior figures close to the First Minister, including her husband, who's also the SNP's chief executive, and her Scottish Government chief of staff. All of those claims are denied by Ms Sturgeon, who says there isn't a shred of evidence of a conspiracy. Mr Salmond had demanded the submissions were published before he appeared before a parliamentary committee, and a group of senior MSPs agreed they could be made public. But within hours, the Crown Office, Scotland's prosecution body, raised concerns about contempt of court and demanded changes for legal reasons. The Scottish Parliament agreed, taking down, making changes to, and then reposting a new version of Mr Salmond's evidence. Mr Salmond has argued before today's developments that the Crown Office isn't fit for purpose and suggested its head, Scotland's Lord Advocate, is conflicted because he's also the Scottish Government's legal adviser. Mr Salmond is due to give evidence to MSPs tomorrow, but as things stand, it can't be certain that will go ahead. His lawyers have asked for urgent clarification about why his submission was changed and have said this could have a material bearing on whether he testifies under oath tomorrow.
A man has been jailed for 15 years after admitting his part in a car bombing that killed a journalist investigating high-level corruption in Malta. Vincent Muscat was one of 3 men accused of murdering Daphne Caruana Galizia in 2017. Here's our Europe correspondent Nick Beak.
Daphne Caruana Galizia became known as a one-woman WikiLeaks. Such was her determination to shine a light on the shadowy finances of the rich and powerful in Malta. Her 30-year pursuit of corruption, wherever it led her, won accolades, but also enemies. Her murder in a remote village in the north of the smallest EU country had a profound and far-reaching impact. The island's Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, resigned after an investigation implicated his close associates in the murder. Today, Vincent Muscat, no relation, admitted he was part of a plot. But it's now the fate of a multi-millionaire defendant that will be most eagerly observed. Jorgen Fennick, who was detained on his luxury yacht, continues to deny he was involved in the assassination. In a statement, Miss Caruana Galizia's family said the murder should have been stopped, but welcomed today's guilty plea as a step towards full justice. The raw fury that the killing sparked in Malta may have subsided with time, but Daphne Caruana Galizia remains an international symbol of pioneering journalism and of a refusal to be intimidated.
You're listening to the 6 o'clock news on BBC Radio 4. The main news so far. Scotland's First Minister has said the country's shops, bars, gyms and hairdressers should be able to start opening at the end of April. A government scientific advisor has warned that poorer areas are likely to be more prone to a new wave of coronavirus infections because of lower take-up of vaccines. Still to come.
I think you have to adjust yourself to a reasonable price of crude. The era of a very cheap source of energy is gone, and this is a new era.
The face and voice of the crippling 1973 oil embargo, Sheikh Ahmed Zaki Yamani, has died at the age of 90. The broadcaster and naturalist Sir David Attenborough has warned that climate change could destroy entire cities and societies if carbon emissions are not cut. He told world leaders at the United Nations Security Council that global warming was the biggest threat to security that humans had ever faced. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale.
Sir David Attenborough has spent his life chronicling the natural world, and so his warnings about climate change carry weight. But rarely has his foreboding been so stark and shared on such a global stage. He told world leaders at the United Nations Security Council that climate change was the biggest threat to security they'd ever faced. He said the world was perilously close to a tipping point that could send global temperatures spiralling catastrophically higher. And this, he said, could destroy entire cities and societies in the lifetime of today's young people.
If we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security. Food production, access to fresh water, habitable ambient temperature, and ocean food chains. And if the natural world can no longer support the most basic of our needs, then much of the rest of civilization will quickly break down.
Sir David said this year's COP26 summit in Glasgow might be the last opportunity for the world to cap carbon emissions and achieve climate stability. We are a single global species, he said, whose threats are shared and whose security must ultimately come from acting together. Boris Johnson, who chaired the virtual council, agreed that climate change was a threat to the collective security of the world. The Prime Minister urged the UN to galvanise its agencies to tackle an issue that he said was as geopolitical as it was environmental.
2 US Senate committees investigating the storming of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January have been told that intelligence failures were behind the breach. There were also disagreements about when the National Guard should have been called in to assist officers who had become overwhelmed. From Washington, here's our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue.
The US Congress hadn't been attacked like this since the War of 1812 against Britain, and the body politic is still reeling from how close protesters came to causing widespread death and injury. Thousands of demonstrators breached the building, sending senators and congressmen and the vice president scurrying for safety. President Trump was blamed by Democrats for inciting the attack and impeached for a second time. There's been significant focus on the intelligence in the run-up to the day, intelligence which the former chief of the Capitol Police, Stephen Sund, who resigned subsequently, said was inaccurate and incomplete.
We properly planned for a mass demonstration with possible violence. What we got was a military-style coordinated assault on my officers and a violent takeover of the Capitol building.
Mr. Sund told the committee that the attackers had brought climbing gear, military-grade CS gas, baseball bats and radios, but there was disagreement between some of the witnesses about the requests for help from the National Guard. Former Sergeant-at-Arms for the House, Paul Irving, said the intelligence ahead of time hadn't justified it.
Based on the intelligence, we all believed that the plan met the threat and that we were prepared. We now know that we had the wrong plan. As one of the senior security leaders responsible for the event, I am accountable for that. I accept that responsibility, and as you know, I have resigned my position.
Intelligence officials will be questioned later, but the FBI has already arrested more than 200 people, dozens of whom have connections to far-right groups. Several police officers are also under investigation for their actions on the day.
Buckingham Palace has said the Duke of Edinburgh is being treated for an infection and is expected to remain in hospital for several more days. He was admitted last Tuesday after feeling unwell. Here's our royal correspondent, Johnny Diamond.
Not since 2018 has Prince Philip spent so long in hospital. Then it was 10 days for a hip replacement. Now it's an unnamed infection that has kept the Prince in King Edward VII Hospital in central London for a week, and says the palace will probably keep him there for several more days. The palace hates giving anything like a commentary on the health of members of the royal family. It insists on their right to privacy. It says only that the Duke is comfortable and responding to treatment. He was visited by one of his sons, Prince Charles, at the weekend. Prince Edward told Sky News today that he'd spoken on the phone to his father recently and that the Duke was feeling much better and looking forward to getting out of hospital.
The new chief executive of the Competition and Markets Authority has told the BBC he believes the UK should follow the example of Australia and attempt stricter regulation of the big technology and social media platforms. Facebook has now resolved a dispute with the Australian government about whether it should pay publishers for news. But Dr. Andrea Coscelli described the company's initial decision to remove all news content from its site as worrisome. Here's our media editor, Amol Rajan.
The Western web that you know and use is based on free and open access. The price of that access is that our personal data trails are sold to advertisers, and mostly by just two advertising companies, Google and Facebook. In his first major broadcast interview, Dr. Andrea Coscelli was clear that these companies, though brilliant, are now so big they are harming competition. There's a £7.3 billion search advertising market in the UK. Google has around 90% of that. Is that too much?
Yeah, it's a problem.
There's a £5.5 billion display advertising market in the UK. Facebook has more than 50% of that. Is that too much?
Yes.
Last night, Facebook resolved its dispute with Australia's government, which wanted a new system of regulation whereby more money from tech platforms went to newspaper businesses. Under its new deal, Facebook retains the right to choose which publishers it will support. Dr. Coscelli wants the UK to consider replicating the Australian model.
I think the Australian approach is a sensible one, where essentially you're trying to convince the companies to have commercial negotiations, but with a proper backstop where an arbitrator essentially appointed by government or parliament would be able to decide who is right if in the end there is no agreement between publishers and the platforms.
The tech giants argue that publishers choose to be on their platforms because they derive value from it. Alas for them, Australia has set a noisy precedent that other countries are now certain to study and are even likely to follow.
Three of the world's biggest digital music services have rejected claims that they pay artists unfairly for their music. Senior representatives from Apple, Spotify and Amazon were giving evidence to MPs on the Digital Culture and Media Committee, who were looking into the impact of online streaming on artists, record labels and the wider music industry. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson was listening.
Apple, Spotify and Amazon were all in attendance, but much of the talk was about one of their rivals, YouTube, brought up by the committee's chair, Julian Knight.
YouTube, are they getting away with it?
Apple's Elena Segal said that one of the biggest challenges for streaming services was trying to make a profit while YouTube appeared to be operating under different rules.
The fact that they don't necessarily have licenses for all of the music that they use and that they don't need to. And even where they do have licenses, the amount they pay because of the way their business model is set up and the way the tariffs work is less.
In the previous session, Jeff Taylor of the BPI revealed that YouTube paid UK record labels £35 million in 2020. Here, Spotify said their corresponding figure was £474 million, 13 times more. The witnesses were also asked about the comments made to the committee by Nadine Shah, that despite being a Mercury Prize-nominated artist, she didn't make enough money from streaming to keep the wolf away from the door and was embarrassed to say that she was struggling to pay her rent. Spotify's Horacio Gutierrez responded.
Streaming is having a positive economic impact on artists, but you have to recognize that when you look at the economics of streaming, you have to look at the different actors in the value chain and how the money trickles down.
Spotify also defended hiring the Duke and Duchess of Sussex to make a podcast series despite the criticisms of low payments to musicians on their service, and laughed off suggestions that Harry and Meghan could save the music business, saying that they were not the only act that they'd signed.
Companies with more than 250 staff have been given another 6 months to fulfil their legal requirement to publish differences in pay between men and women. It's the second time the deadline for reporting the gender pay gap has been postponed. The details from our business correspondent, Darshini David.
With women most likely to be employed in the hardest hit sectors and undertake caring responsibilities, MPs and campaigners have been concerned that the pandemic may push gender equality into reverse. Some were disappointed when the enforcement of gender pay gap reporting, which maintains the spotlight on women's workplace progression, was suspended at the start of the crisis last year and wanted it resumed this spring. But employers will now have until October to comply. The Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is responsible for policing the rules, says the delay strikes the right balance between supporting business and enforcing these important regulations. They urge big employers to report their figures as soon as possible. Only 5% of the 12,000 or so have filed to date. The TUC calls the delay unnecessary, saying now is not the time to turn our backs on equality.
In the city, the 100 share index ended the day up 13 points at 6,626. On Wall Street a short time ago, the Dow Jones was down 137 points at 31,385. On the currency markets, the pound is up 0.3% against the dollar at $1.41. Against the euro, sterling is up 0.3% at €1.16.1, making a euro worth 86.2 pence. A relative of the Queen has been jailed for 10 months after he admitted sexually assaulting a woman at his ancestral home. Simon Bowes-Lyon, who's the Earl of Strathmore, is the owner of Glamis Castle, which is where the Queen Mother grew up. Dundee Sheriff Court was told his victim still suffers panic attacks and nightmares a year after the assault. Bowes-Lyon has been placed on the sex offenders register for 10 years. Police in Cambridgeshire say 18 people have been rescued from the back of a refrigerated lorry at a service station on the A1M near Peterborough. Officers say they were alerted this morning by the driver of the vehicle, who told them he'd noticed people on board and was concerned for their welfare. No arrests have been made. The former Scotland, Manchester United and Leeds United footballer Gordon McQueen has been diagnosed with vascular dementia. The 68-year-old earned 30 international caps and won the First Division title with Leeds in 1974. In a statement, his family said they wanted footballers of today's generation to know there may be risks with persistent heading of the ball. The former Saudi oil minister, Sheikh Zaki Yamani, has died at the age of 90. He held the position for more than 20 years and played a key role in the oil embargo of 1973 that led to a sharp rise in prices and contributed to a global recession. As our economics correspondent Andrew Walker reports, the move made him a controversial figure in the West.
The era of cheap fuel and cheap energy is over. And from now on, instead of arguing about how to achieve economic growth, we've all got to face the possibility of no economic growth at all.
Sheikh Yamani, more than any other figure, came to be associated in the public mind with the idea of oil supply as an economic and political weapon. A group of Middle East countries responded to the Yom Kippur War in 1973 with an embargo, initially on supplies to the United States for its support of Israel. Sheikh Yamani responded to criticism of the move.
I think this is very unfair. I don't know why they call it blackmail. We are fighting an enemy. We were sacrificing by producing much more than what we have to. Now, all what we did so far is not to produce that much.
The resulting fourfold increase in oil prices did severe international economic damage, including in Britain. In subsequent years, the exporters group OPEC sought to manage oil prices by adjusting output with varying degrees of success. Speaking to the BBC in 2011, the Sheikh looked back at OPEC's record.
I don't think a high price of oil is a good thing. No, I'm not proud. Unfortunately, I regret the mistakes that OPEC did.
His term as Saudi oil minister and his life were almost cut short in 1975 when he was held hostage by a Palestinian-linked militant group that included the notorious terrorist Carlos the Jackal. The Sheikh was told that he would be killed, but he was eventually released.
The headlines again. Nicola Sturgeon has set a provisional date of April the 26th for shops, bars, restaurants and gyms to reopen in Scotland. Boris Johnson has said a review led by Michael Gove will consider deep and complex ethical issues around the issuing of so-called COVID passports. An advisor to the government on infectious diseases has warned that a failure to vaccinate deprived communities could prompt a new wave of infections. A man has been jailed for 15 years after admitting being involved in the assassination of the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. And David Attenborough has told world leaders that if left unchecked, climate change will cause the breakdown of civilization. BBC News.
And our lovely colleague Corrie Corfield was reading the news for the very last time. We all wish her well.